Welcome to Innovator Café, the entrepreneur go-to, with your host, attorney Dave Stevens. Through each episode, Dave and his guests provide resources and assurances to build a company growth roadmap. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the website stevenslawgroup.com. Now here's the host of Innovator Café, Dave Stevens.
Hey guys, welcome to Innovator Café. Welcome back. Today we have a special guest, McCoy Smith, who is a specialist in open source. And I'm really excited about this one because anywhere I go, anybody I talk to, there's always this confusion about open source, a lot of anecdotal ideas that people take for granted. And we're hoping to demystify all of this and inform you really well. I mean, we want to talk to early stage startup companies that haven't even launched their product, middle stage companies who have launched their product or ready to launch their product, and big companies who probably haven't spent enough attention to open source issues, and they want to get their policies and practices in proper order. McCoy has a deep background in open source. He's almost like a universal soldier in that regard. He's worked with large corporation Intel for over 20 years, consulted with small, medium, and large companies. Many of them are my clients, and so he sees a lot. And if there's one thing I learned about open source is experience is really the key. There's so much going on. It takes so much time to get your head around particular things that you really need some deep experience to truly understand what the possible liabilities are. So McCoy, again, welcome.
Thank you.
Really good to have you here.
Thank you.
How about you give us a general overview of what is open source, and why should people be thinking about this at early stages in their company?
Open source is nothing more than a licensing model for intellectual property rights. And people who work in intellectual property or just general business transactional work know that anytime you've got some intellectual property rights, you want to convey certain of those rights to another party, you do some sort of licensing agreement. Open source is a subset of the general world of licensing agreements, who has as its goal to convey downstream very broad permissive rights to intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
And now typically it's used for software, and typically the way that it works is you have some software and you use a license, an open source license, to deliver to the user the source code for the software, which is the format of software, which is the editable version that human programmers use in order to create and modify software. So you convey those rights under an open source license. You give them the source code. And the open source licenses say things like, or they do not put restrictions on things like this trade secret status of the source code, does not impose restrictions on what sorts of modifications may be made or to whom the software may be further delivered, things of that nature. Now, it gets a little bit more complex because there's a whole universe of these open source licenses out there, some of which also impose obligations like, if you give it under this license, then the person receiving it must, when they use it, deliver the source code to whoever they convey it to. That's what they call a copyleft a license. There are other licenses that don't impose that obligation. So there's this broad panoply of different types of these licenses. Some of them are highly permissive and do not impose almost any obligations on the user. Some of them impose certain obligations that can be problematic depending on the business model that you may be working in.
Well, so from the programmer's point of view, I mean, from the manager's point of view, they have, coders working under them, right? They could be pulling code from anywhere, right?
Right.
And it's almost like herding cats. You hire somebody new, they have their own methods and own sources of finding things. There is not this open source website where everybody goes to. It's Reddit, it's all these other places, where you can pick up this code.
Right.
So how do you manage that? I imagine with some kind of policies, but what do you do when you're trying to manage a group of people who are coding your stuff?
Yeah, so there actually are a couple of sites where almost all this stuff is now reposited and where people get it. The big one is GitHub. There's another one called SourceForge. Those are the two main places where people tend to put their code under an open source license. But you're right. You can find it on Reddit. You can find it on any number of different places. But those are the two big ones. So question is, as a manager, what do you do? Well, the first thing you got to do is figure out what your position is going to be on all of this stuff, i.e., is open source code something that we really don't want to use in our products for whatever reason, or is open source software something we want to encourage to be used in our product for whatever reason? We'll talk a little bit more depth about how you can make those sort of decisions. But once you make those decisions about what your receptivity is to the use of third-party software that may be under an open source license, then typically what is done is you put together a policy that says, okay, our policy in our company is, open source code is prohibited, open source code is encouraged, open source code may be used under the following circumstances. There's a broad panoply of policies that companies have. I will say it's becoming more and more rare to see companies come in and say you can't use open source at all, because the reality is there's so much of this stuff out there and it's so useful, and so many programmers are used to using this sort of stuff, that to have a blanket policy that says this cannot be used at all is probably going to grind the gears to something of a halt at some point. But some companies still have policies like that. So in the end, what happens is companies put together a policy about their attitudes toward this stuff. And then it gets to different degrees of sophistication about how one manages that policy. Most companies these days now will have a infrastructure in place of some sort. They're usually called an OSPO, Open Source Programming Office. And the OSPO's function within a company is to police the policy and to manage the process of understanding what's coming in, what obligations attach to what's coming in, and ensuring that when it's going out the door, the obligations are fulfilled. There's also a small industry that's been built around automated tools for managing this sort of process. And in particular, there are tools that are designed to scan code bases and identify if there have been instances of use of open source code, so that the company can say, okay, well, we've got open source code in here. This tool has identified it for us. Was that done consistent with our policy? And therefore we will follow the obligations of the license, or was that done contrary to our policies? And we have to do something to make sure it does conform to our policies. So again, bigger companies have a lot of this infrastructure in place. They may have very large teams in their OSPO that manage all of this process. Smaller companies, they may have one or two people that do this. They may or may not rely on these tools depending on how big their stack is. or the terminology that we use is an SBOM, software bill of material. So this is an articulation of all the components that go into a piece of software, where it came from and what the license associated with it is. Other companies may just be too small to, hire this infrastructure. And I've got a separate business that I run that will run an OSPO for a company, for a small company. So, I have companies that hire my consultancy business, and they say, hey, listen, we only need help in administering a process of reviewing our use of open source, twice a year for a couple of hours. We don't want to hire somebody full time for that. It doesn't make economic sense for us, but we'll hire you on an hourly basis to just, whenever these issues come up, you will consult with us and give us advice on how to do that. So, and there are other people who do this sort of consultancy. I know most of them. So depending on the size of your organization and how complicated your stack is and how much open source you think you're using or are actually using, different people do different levels of sophistication on this stuff.
So for people who are listening right now who have no idea what their coders are using, let's walk through how you would step in as a consultant and do an audit. Like, I have no idea where they're getting their code. Where do we start? And what are the ramifications if we find something, right?
Right. So again, different people do it different ways. Sometimes it's just a process of talking to the developer base and getting them to identify where they got the code that they've used. Did you write it yourself? Did you get it from someplace else? If you did, where? Provide a link or provide a copy of the license. So for smaller companies where you've got a small team of developers and you've got a high degree of trust in their ability to report out what they're doing, that sometimes works. The bigger companies where you've got a huge developer team, you may not be confident that everybody there is going to correctly report out their potential use of open source. They will rely on things like these scan tools to identify in an objective, mechanistic way exactly what's in the code base itself. And it'll create an SBOM. So it'll say, I've scanned these hundreds or thousands of files. Here are the 40 or 100 different open source licenses that I found in my scan. They are associated with the following files. And then once you have that sort of data, you can look at that as compared to whatever policy that you want to adopt and see if there's anything identified as a result of that scan that causes a problem with how your policy is implemented.
Right. So when these guys are thinking about SBOM, they're not thinking like it's a bad thing. Oh my God, they dropped an F-bomb, right? This SBOM is really informative, right? It's not like anybody, gets carted off in handcuffs because they used open source or they misused it. I really want to demystify that, because people think of open source, they think of something nefarious or stolen, right? So talk about that a bit. What exactly are you searching for, and can we pull people's head out of the sand and look at this without any big threat to them?
Right. Well, one of the things the development of SBOM has actually been a thing that's starting to become kind of an industry standard, and you will find, depending on what industry you're in, that the supply chain, it might very well be requiring this of you as a supplier. So I think, as the industry evolves in this area, you will see more and more companies. The bigger high-tech companies that are reliant on third-party code are becoming more and more insistent that their suppliers provide to them a verified SBOM so that they can take a look at what's in the code that's being delivered to them to make sure that their supplier is following good practices and that they're not delivering to the customer software that's going to cause the customer a problem when it integrates it into their own product and distributes it downstream. So SBOMs are not only are they a good thing for cleanliness of understanding what's in your product and legal cleanliness to ensure that you know what's in it, what the legal obligations attendant to it are, but it's something that at some point a lot of companies are going to find that their customers are going to say, I want you to supply this to me and I want it to be configured in a certain way and validated in a certain way so I can be sure that what you're giving me is something that I think I can work with according to my own policies.
It sounds familiar, even in the medical field, right? It's people who avoid the doctor, right? I mean, you need to go in for the blood panel to see if there's anything wrong and how things can be improved, right? If you look the other way and avoid it, these problems don't go away, right? And they're usually pretty easily fixed, right? Aren't they?
Right. Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, it depends a little bit on how long you've waited to actually do this sort of examination. It's a little bit like if you've got some extremely terrible disease and you wait until you're on death's door to go to the doctor, it may be too late. But, early identification of information and potential problems is the best course of action that I think everybody understands to follow, because what you don't want to do is, and I've seen this occur before. You've got a Monday launch date, and on Friday somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I just noticed we've got this thing in there. It might be a problem. What do I do?" And as somebody who works with engineers all the time, you know that you can't just pull stuff out of a software stack and deliver it 3 days later and think it's going to work effectively. There's all sorts of rewriting of code, testing that needs to happen anytime you do something like that. Now, if it's identified early in the process, actually at the input stage, so somebody comes and says, okay, we're building this product. I found a nice piece of code out there that does exactly what I want to do, so I don't have to write it myself. It has this open source license with it. Is it okay for me to integrate it into this product? If you have that sort of process where you identify this stuff up front, then you don't get to the point where it's fully integrated, tested, et cetera, into the product. And right before launch, you discover that you may have to pull it out, or you may be creating a problem for your downstream customer.
Right. Early forgiveness, or I'm sorry, early permission is much more valuable than later forgiveness, right? Because these problems really.
Yeah. Despite the adage that says it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, it's better to ask for permission than forgiveness, at least in this context.
Right.
Most legal things, it's better to ask for permission than forgiveness.
Yeah, especially something like source code that is baked into your product, right? That's relied upon even after it's in the customer's hands, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, tell me how companies can use this as a strategy, right? It sounds like a pretty. I mean, how can programmers nowadays work without their shortcuts? Once they have this luxury of getting these easy, simple things done, like a shopping cart or some type of inbox or something that's pretty straightforward. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. A company that has innovation that's doing something different, that's something that they're coding by themselves. But these accessory type stuff, that's the stuff that's so easy to grab and use, right? How can they use this in their strategy?
Yeah, well, what you find is for software, there's a lot of stuff out there that everybody needs, and it's incredibly inefficient for everybody to write their own to do exactly the same thing. So in a lot of ways, what you see is, and there are organizations out there, the Linux Foundation is the best example of this, who do this all the time, what they do is you see a coalition of companies get together and say, okay, we all need software that does X. What we would like to do is collaborate together in an open way to create X and then release it open source so that anybody can use it. We can all use it as a shared resource, and therefore we're not individually all spending engineering resources to do exactly the same thing when we can share this resource with anybody who needs it, and therefore decrease overall engineering cost amongst us. That's a very common strategy for companies. And then they can innovate on top of that. So they can say, okay, X is a shared resource for us all, but there's things above X that we will all create individually that will be, as people usually describe it in the tech industry, our secret sauce. Mm-hmm. So we'll all do our secret sauce on top of the shared resources. That's how we'll differentiate our product between ourselves. And therefore, we'll focus our engineering resources on the things, our product differentiators, and not on the shared resource that all of us need to use.
Right. Well, here's a good thing to demystify too right now is that this secret sauce, this stuff that you have, that's the company's intellectual property.
Yes.
Right. So often I'll hear they'll say, are we going to use open source or are we going to do something in file patents? Right. Well, you could do both, right?
Yeah, so for patents, it's an interesting discussion because most of these open source licenses will have some degree of a patent grant in them. Either the newer ones do it expressly, the older ones sometimes it's implied, or at least theoretically it's an implied patent license. So to the extent that you may have claims that cover that open source code that you ship, those claims may be licensed at least for the code under the code that you ship under that license. But as you know, with patent claim drafting, you can draft a lot of stuff around that may be outside of the open source and therefore may not be licensed. So it's a complicated patents. Talking patent strategy and open source is a super interesting discussion, and you may be giving up some patent rights, but that's part of the bargain you make for creating the shared resource and getting potentially the patent rights of the other contributors to the shared resource. But you always have the opportunity to pursue patents on the secret sauce that you put above the shared resource. And in a lot of cases, the patents are going to apply to people who don't use just shared resource and create the thing on their own. So they don't participate in the open source community. They're creating their own proprietary version of it.
Right. And of course, you could also have trade secrets and copyrights. I mean, these are the intellectual assets, intellectual property assets of the company that they've built and developed on their own. It's what they innovate, right?
Right. And again, the open source software licenses, they're generally going to require you to disclose the source code. So you've kind of lost the trade secret status of the source code, which many companies protect fairly zealously. But again, that's where you keep your secret sauce. If you've got trade secrets in the source code, you're not going to want to open source that. You're going to want to keep that as the secret sauce part of your stack. The copyright rights, these licenses are all based on copyrights, and software is a creature, at least in part, of copyright law. So if you're going to use the open source license, you're going to give up certain copyright rights to that. But there are other ways to protect the secret parts of your copyrights or the proprietary parts of your copyright by ensuring that that's not impinged upon by the open source license.
Got it. How else can a company thinking about open source as a strategy? They kind of, I often hear that they hear this kind of like this liability that they need to ascertain, right? How do they use it as a strategy for their company?
Well, there are any number of different strategies that people have implemented using open source. In some cases, there are companies out there where almost their entire software companies where almost their entire software stack is open source. And, a lot of people say, well, how on earth are they making money? Well, they're making money by selling maintenance services or updates, proprietary or early updates. So you can sell things around. So you're not selling the code itself. You're selling things that help the customer use the code that you've given them essentially for free, and giving them unlimited rights to use. So that's one model that companies do. There are other companies that do what's often called COOSS, or core or commercial open source. And that's kind of what I described before, where you've got part of your stack is open source and other parts of your stack are proprietary. You're differentiating and you're really selling the proprietary stuff. The open source stuff is something that you give away for free as sort of a spur for people to buy the proprietary stuff that comes with it. There's another model where people use open source as sort of a trial model, where you say, listen, I've got this code. I'm going to give it to you under an open source license, which may impose a lot of obligations that you may not necessarily like to have to abide by. But if you come to me, I'll sell it to you under a non-open source license. And that'll pass along rights that you don't have to deal with all the problems that you may encounter with abiding by the open source license obligation. That's called dual licensing or multi-licensing. A lot of companies do that as a way to spur people to purchase a proprietary license to code that they otherwise deliver open source. And then another model is hardware companies do this. I used to work for a hardware company. Mm-hmm. They're selling hardware. The software is just something that helps people understand that the value of the hardware that they're selling. They want the free software to run best on their own hardware, so that the people who use the open source software say, hey, I'm going to buy hardware X because I know the open source has been optimized for it, and therefore that's the platform I want to purchase. So
sure,
there are many other models that people use.
Brand, yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of models that people have come up with, and there's probably more that people will come up with around this. You just have, you have to understand the obligations that come with the software, and make sure that it doesn't impinge upon the way in which you want your money to be made.
Right. Well, talk about any other misconceptions people have about open source software. They really shouldn't be fearing looking into this, should they?
Yeah. So I started off in this stuff about 22 years ago.
Yeah.
And, back then it was almost all fear.
Right.
Most companies just had a policy that said, you don't do this. Part of that was because, it was still kind of niche. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff out there, and people hadn't spent the time to kind of understand how these licenses worked or thought through how one could make business out of it.
And a lot of it seemed like borrowed, untested code in their minds, right?
Yeah. A lot of it was perceived as, people sitting in their basement writing code and then just shooting it out into the internet. And right. How do I know if that person is legit, or they know how they're coding or whatever? Right. And that was a long time ago. A lot of that was false anyway. It was just right. People sort of made a very general assumption about what this stuff was without really thinking it through. Well, around 2000, most of the high-tech industry said, we can't avoid this stuff. Number one, there's a lot of it out there. Number two, a lot of it's good. And number three, for a lot of companies, it potentially acts as a competitor to a proprietary vendor who perhaps is getting a little too greedy or trying to impose too many restrictions upon me, and I want to find alternatives that I don't have to deal with that sort of stuff. So around 2000, much of the industry started getting smart on this stuff, and a lot of companies started to realize, the stuff, I can understand the risks. I'm okay with accepting those risks in terms of the legal obligations. And in fact, I can take advantage of the benefits because they substantially outweigh the risks. So you saw a large growing adoption of open source. More and more of the big tech companies started actually producing open source or collaborating to produce open source, making it part of their product stack. And at this point, as I said at the beginning here, almost everybody who's got any sort of significant software stack is using this stuff. Most of them know that, some of them may not, but it's a little naive to think that you can create an entire software stack on your own without taking advantage of some of this stuff.
Right. Well, what are the hot topics around open source now? Now that we've kind of demystified it, there's a lot of acceptance, as you can see, around the industry. What is interesting to talk about now, and what should people be aware of that are using or setting up, or at least even auditing their system?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about hot topics, things that are, the people who think a lot about open source and the law have been talking a lot about lately. One of them is there's a lawsuit in California right now in Orange County, California State Court, where a nonprofit entity is suing a manufacturer for using open source in their product, but not releasing the source code. The case is called Software Freedom Conservancy versus Vizio. Again, it's in California State Court in Orange County, California. There was recently a decision on a motion for summary judgment, which established really for the first time anywhere in the world that there may be a third-party beneficiary right to enforce these open source licenses. So up until that case, enforcement of open source licenses that had always been by the author or copyright holder of the code who had put it out under an open source license. The theory in this case is if I receive open source code as a consumer, I ought to have the right to ask the vendor to deliver the source code to me under the terms of the license that comes with that. That's a new theory, and many of us who monitor these sort of things are keeping an eye on it. Again, it's a summary judgment motion, so it's not a definitive ruling, but it's something that's testing out a new legal theory.
Kind of surprised it's taken this long, right? I mean, people are giving and taking. You'd think that there would be some obligation, but these are private entities.
Yeah, enforcement of open source licenses has been pretty rare. There was a little flurry of them in sort of the late 2000s. There was a few cases in Germany 10 years or so ago. But for the most part, these licenses often don't get enforced in the court of law. That's because in a lot of cases, they get enforced in the court of public opinion. So entities who don't abide by their obligations to open source licenses often are named and shamed by the broad community of open source developers. And that oftentimes acts as a spur to them to fix their problems, lest they don't get the benefit of open source developers helping them with their their own products. So that has been a strategy that has been, I think, generally pretty successful without the use of litigation. But occasionally you will find circumstances where there are litigation. There's probably, I want to say, 10 or 12 open source license enforcement cases that have been filed around the United States in the past 20 years. Now, whether that will tick up or down, you never know, but it's always there. And it's a risk if people are using open source that, if you don't abide by the license and somebody is ticked off enough about it to take you to court, you're going to have yourself a problem you're going to have to deal with.
Well, yeah, you could imagine organizations, charitable or nonprofit organizations, could find lots of resources once they realize these things could possibly be successful.
Yeah, that remains to be seen. I don't know if this is going to be an outlier. It's going to be it's the start of a trend. We'll see. But it does open a potential other vector for you to potentially have to stand up in court for failure to abide by the terms of the license. Sure. Now, another issue that's a very hot topic in the open source world is AI, and there's two aspects to that. One of which is there's this long, ongoing, and fairly robust debate going on right now about should AI be open source? And if so, how exactly do you do that? Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting philosophical question and legal question because, we understand how software can be open source. That's been done for a long time. And of course, these AI systems they do have a lot of software within them. But a lot of the value add of the AI is the result of the training that they do. So there's within the AI system, it is creating these massive databases of weights or vectors or something that resembles its distillation down of all the information it's input into understanding the relationships between various things.
Yeah, it's not like ascertaining source code that is this static thing, right?
Yeah,
it's more of the methods around it.
Right. So there's a raging debate about how one goes about whether it should be open source, and if so, how one goes about doing it. And I did a webinar on this 6 months or so ago about my thoughts on it. It's an interesting, complicated question I'm not sure it's completely resolved, and I'm not sure that under the current paradigm of intellectual property law, you necessarily can come up with a very good answer. But so that's an interesting debate. The other interesting debate is the result of litigation. Now, I think we all know that AI systems are getting sued left and right all over the place, particularly up in Northern California. But there is a case where there is a tool or a couple of tools. The most notable is called Copilot, which is designed to allow you to enter prompts, and it will write out the actual source code in the language you have selected for a way to implement the prompt that you've asked it to do. So you say, can you write for me in Python a script that will do a discrete cosine transform, and it'll churn out some code that supposedly does that. Now, the problem or the claim is that system has trained itself on a mass of code on repositories like GitHub and SourceForge, all of which is under open source licenses, some of which obligate you to disclose the source code and to use the same license. And when you get an output from the tool, it gives you the script. It doesn't tell you, oh, this is copyright X and this is under the following license.
Yeah, there are no citations. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but the theory is, of course, is that these systems are not reproducing scripts. They are learning how scripts are written and independently coming up with code that fulfills the obligations of the prompt according to the syntax, grammar, etc. of the language you've asked it to do. Anyway, so there's a lawsuit over that up in the Northern District of California, and that may have some interesting implications for open source compliance and sort of the fundamental questions about what exactly copyright covers in code. And this has been a debate that's been going on, I think, since the 70s.
Sure, long before AI.
Yeah. And Google versus Oracle is a famous case fairly recently, where this was debated back and forth for many, many years. What was the reproduction of interfacing code something that implicated copyright infringement or not, and under what theory? If it was not, under what theory of copyright law was it not? So excuse me. So this is another piece of that, this case up in the Northern District of California. And we're monitoring it to see if it teaches us anything more about open source compliance or how these licenses work.
Right. That would make AI extremely complicated if they suddenly had these obligations, wouldn't it? I mean, how could you possibly allow this thing to produce code if all these obligations fell on you?
Yeah, and the exact same questions are being asked about the non-code AI tools like Midjourney and DALL-E and ChatGPT and things like that. And you're getting the exact same debate. Okay, if I scan the entire internet for every piece of written content and use that to train an AI, and it outputs an image or text, is that copyright infringement of the portions of the training data that was used to train it? And you're getting all sorts of different, very vigorous debates about that, and we will see how that all falls out. But it's a piece of the smaller debate on the code generation tools that are out there.
Sure. And as this evolves, as it becomes more prevalent, just like open source is, as this separate resource, it's going to be something that people are going to really want to keep their eyes on. Because if open source is your strategy, and then ChatGPT or this AI becomes another part of your strategy, there's this new layer of liability that's coming on you.
Yeah, although I will say that you're starting to see the companies that offer these tools offer some degree of liability protection for the customers that use it. Now, usually those are only the customers that are paying for it, not the people who are using the free version.
Right.
But you are seeing various of these companies coming out. I think I saw an announcement last week on one of them. I can't remember which one. That said, essentially, if you're a paid subscriber to this tool and for whatever reason you get sued because the output of this tool is claimed by somebody as being an infringement of their IP rights because the tool was trained in part upon their content, we will back you up to a certain extent.
Got it.
But that's an issue that, the first users of these tools raised concerns about. Hey, I'm going to use your tool and it's going to cause me to get sued. You got to do something about that.
Right. Okay, well, to wrap it up, why don't we talk briefly? I know we talked a little bit about auditing now, but if someone was to engage you in an audit, what kind of homework could they do to at least give themselves some visibility to talk to you about when they're, I don't know who they're talking to, the people who are coding, the managers, where do they start looking?
Well, usually my first questions are pretty basic. Do you have a policy?
Right.
And if so, what is it? Do you have a software bill of materials or something that documents where your code came from and what licenses are associated with it? Do you use an auditing tool to scan your code to see if there's open source in there? And if so, can I take a look at it? These are the basic questions I ask. And, sometimes I get yes to all of that. And sometimes I get no to all of that.
Right.
And, then we walk through with them what they may want to do to improve upon what they're currently doing, and also getting together the necessary information, however it may be gathered, so that I can take a look at it and give them some advice. So that's basically it. So I'm more than willing to work with anybody, even if they come in and say, I don't know what open source is. I don't have a policy. I don't know what's in my code. I never heard of scanning tools. What can you do for me? And I say, well, I can do a lot for you. It's probably going to cost you more than it would have been if you'd spent a little bit more time thinking about this. But, I'll help you get into a place where maybe this isn't as an expensive a problem next time around.
Again, the earlier, the better. I run into the same things when they come to me and talk about protecting intellectual property. You see it too, right? Sometimes it's too late, right? There are deadlines, you've sold a product and time has passed, you can't get patents, and you have other copyright issues and trade secrets, right? Set the policy early, and it's simple. It's really simple. But right, some people need a lot more handholding. They just were in a hurry, especially startups. They want to get this product out. People are clamoring for it. They're starving, right? They're bootstrapping. They don't have a lot of money, and they want to launch this product, right? So it really depends where they are in their process, and you and I, we take them as they are, right?
And there's no shame. There's no shame in having made decisions that were in the best interest of your company that may have jeopardized certain rights that you had. If it's the difference between continuing to have a viable company and possibly giving up some IP rights, you're going to do what you can to keep the company viable.
No doubt.
But yes, the better one engages somebody to counsel them on the best options available to them, the better decision making they're going to have. Even if they decide, you probably have encountered this. I certainly have encountered companies where I'd say, we could file on this and we can get it on file before your launch date, but it may not make sense for you to spend the money to do that. So, it's up to you to make that business decision. That's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. Now, in the case of open source, oftentimes the discussion is, well, you could do this, you're not going to be in compliance with the license, and that increases the risk that somebody could sue you or somebody could name and shame you or whatever. So you have to be aware that, that's a bigger risk decision than some of these other things that we've talked about. But
that's not just a monetary thing of being sued or negotiating and dealing with things. If someone's going to condemn your company on social media, it truly damn your company, right?
Yes, it could. Yeah. So, Yep, that's the way it works.
That's great. Any last thoughts?
No, hey, I guess I should put a plug in.
Please do that. Yeah.
I have a book. If you look over my shoulder here, it's in my bookcase. There's a book out from Oxford University Press. It's called Open Source Law and Policy, I think is the title. I'm an author. I authored the chapters on copyright and patent as it relates to open source. Mm-hmm. It's a bit expensive if you want the dead wood version of it. but there's a free version available online. So you can download every chapter of this book from Oxford University Press for free. And you get a wonderful resource about all sorts of different issues that occur in open source world, written by lots of my friends who operate in the open source world around the world. So We've got authors from the UK, Italy, Germany, et cetera, et cetera. It's written from an international perspective, not just US. So you get to learn a little bit about the differences in law as they relate to open source in various parts of the world. So if take a look at that, it's Oxford University Press. My law firm, I do a blog where I talk about this stuff occasionally, and I also have posted on my law firm webpage various webinars or lectures I've done around the world over the years on a variety of different open source issues. I also promote that through things like LinkedIn and X or Twitter, Mastodon, and things like that. So.
Well, what can you give your website so our listeners can look you up and learn more about?
So it's pretty easy. It's www.lexpan.law. It's my law firm name.
Law.
Yeah, and there's a lot of links on there. But if you go to either the blog or the video, audio links, there's a lot of stuff on there for free, where you can learn about various topics that I have found interesting or that I thought people ought to be aware of.
Got it. Well, McCoy, thank you so much. That was very informative. I know our listeners greatly appreciate this because there's so much out there that is just odd and strange. They think it's like a black box. And I think you've just kind of demystified and opened up that box and made it a little more palatable and less fearful.
Yeah, there was a lot of fear a long time ago. Now it's sort of like, yeah, we understand what this is and how it works. And, a lot of people have understood that it's something that we all can live with and can actually benefit from. So, yes.
Sounds great. Thanks again, McCoy. And this has been another edition of Innovator Cafe. Hope you come back for the next one. We'll have more throughout the year on different topics just like this. Stick around, McCoy. We'll have some follow-up afterward.
Okay. Nice talking to you.
You've been tuning into Innovator Cafe, the entrepreneur go-to, with your host, attorney Dave Stevens. You can find more episodes on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the website, StevensLawGroup.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.